Easter Island, a barren stretch of land in the Pacific Ocean, some 3,500 kilometers west of the South American continent, the most isolated piece of inhabited land on Earth. But events once took place here that should serve as a warning for the whole of our planet. Years before the first Europeans found the island in 1772, the whole population seems to have been engaged in one frenzied activity, the carving of giant statues known as moai. Without the help of wheels or animals, they managed to transport these statues to sacred sites all over the island. At the same time, every single tree was cut down. Archaeology has shown that there were once large areas of rich forest. These became as barren as a desert. How had the islanders managed to move these massive statues? Legend had it the statues walked. That was surely no more than a myth, but sometimes myths contain a grain of truth. In 1986, in the course of his expedition to Easter Island, Thor Heyerdahl, the renowned Norwegian explorer, set out to demonstrate how it might have been done. A Czech archaeologist had observed that the further the statues were from the place where they were all carved, the more rounded their bases had become. This gave Thor Heyerdahl the clue he had been looking for. The statues might not have walked, but with a little help from ropes and pulleys, perhaps they had been persuaded to waddle. But the mysterious history of Easter Island has more to teach us than how huge statues can be made to walk. Of all the species on this planet, man is by far the most destructive. We're the only species to wage organized war against our own kind, not just for survival, but for often fanatical reasons such as an urge to achieve hegemony. Reasons that subsequent generations find hard to understand. Ever since our earliest ancestors first learned how to fashion a club out of a piece of wood, not a single week has gone by that has not been disfigured by war somewhere on our planet. Tribe against tribe, village against village, and in more recent times, nation against nation. Quite suddenly, our planet seems to be confronted by enormous challenges. Wells go dry, forests disappear, rivers are reduced to a trickle, fish stocks are depleted, more and more species of wildlife become extinct, and perhaps the most threatening challenge of all, human population continues to grow. The Great Wall of China. Today it's China's most popular tourist attraction, but originally its purpose was to keep out marauding barbarians, giving the Chinese a chance to live tranquil and civilized lives. In fact, life for the Chinese people has been far from tranquil. Whatever becomes of China in the 21st century, it's already possible to say with certainty that this is not the nation-state that Chairman Mao had in mind. How has it been possible for a quarter of the world's population to change their lifestyle so dramatically? Lester Brown is founder of the Earth Policy Institute.
When a country can rapidly reduce its birth rate, then it gets something that the economists call a demographic bonus, because there comes a period in the country when there are very few young people, and most of the population is concentrated in the working age group. And there are not yet many old people because the increase in life expectancy is fairly recent. So you have a population pyramid with not many people at the bottom, not many people at the top, and a lot of people in the working population. So it becomes much easier to increase savings in that situation, and you increase savings and investment and get very rapid economic growth. And that has happened in most of the countries in East Asia.
Just 30 years ago, everyone of working age in China owned a bicycle. Bicycles caused no pollution and hardly any serious accidents. They gave Chinese cities like Beijing an air of peace and tranquility, in direct contrast to the noisy bustle and hustle of Bangkok, say, or Tokyo. If this was communism in action, there was much to be said for it. It couldn't last. If China was to give expression to a new age of prosperity and progress, it was inevitable that the bicycle would give way to the motor car. The new and rapidly growing middle class, living in cities and towns that are themselves growing at great speed, are well aware, through the internet, of what life is like in New York or Los Angeles. They know what they want, even if the sun becomes a dull smudge in the polluted sky above them. Chairman Mao still looks down from his place of honor at the entrance to the Forbidden City. But the new China he thought he was creating has utterly changed from the dull uniformity he tried to impose on the people. It was Deng Xiaoping who started the modern phase of China's industrialization. Within a single generation, the blink of an eye in the context of China's long history, a new industrial revolution took place, faster than anything our planet has witnessed before. With a population that will soon pass the 1.5 billion mark, the sons and daughters of peasant farmers now find themselves operating the machines that within a few decades will produce more manufactured goods than anywhere else on Earth. If there is one legacy of Chairman Mao's that still has a strong influence over life in modern China, it is an unquestioning obedience to the popular will, as interpreted by the ruling Communist Party. But every industrial revolution needs energy to drive it forward. For China, the most readily available source of power is coal. The city of Jincheng and the surrounding province have some of the largest coal deposits in the world. The problem for China is that coal can be mined easily and cheaply at the expense of the environment. In the late 1990s, Professor Cheng Zhu was already aware of this problem.
That is a question, and from the scientific view of that, we couldn't make exactly the number for example how much forest coverage can compensate the pollution problem, but in the last several years, particularly we got the economic booming and we have the environmental pollution, and we know that.
Money has a voice of its own in communist China, just as it does everywhere else. Jincheng province earns millions of dollars from coal production, with 10 million tons being produced and distributed annually. Today, at the same time as new coal power stations are under construction, old coal mines, often small, usually unsafe and highly polluting, are being shut down. If the day finally comes when coal is not just seen as a dirty substance threatening the very future of mankind as a whole, then the future of Jincheng province may look rather bleaker than it does today. China's leaders know very well that a prosperous future will depend on renewable sources of energy. With coal so cheap and plentiful, it is hard to persuade all planners that wind farm development on a massive scale should be regarded as a top priority. In fact, wind power in China has already taken off, and its cumulative wind power capacity already produces more energy than is produced by its nuclear power capacity. In some places in Europe, land-based windmills are deeply unpopular. Noisy and unsightly, they are considered by many to be a blight on the landscape. On all sides, the cry can be heard, "Not in my backyard." For China, the debate will always be different. Wind farms can be situated in remote areas, well away from large cities. And the common need of the people as a whole is a much stronger force here than individual dissent. The arguments for and against solar panels are quite different. They are much cheaper to manufacture than windmills, but also less efficient. To generate electricity on a large scale, the panels must be spread over a huge area, land that might otherwise be used for growing food or planting trees. In a country like China, where the population is increasing by 1 million people every second month, such considerations are of vital importance. They have land to spare for experiments on a massive scale. Already they claim that 1/5 of all the electricity consumed in China comes from renewable sources. And the government has set itself what has to be a realistic target: to more than double today's capacity by year 2030. Considering the size of the population, this is a huge achievement. In 1979, China's new leader, Deng Xiaoping, embarked on the most ambitious experiment in population control that the world has ever witnessed. It was known as the one-child policy. It was very simple. Every newly married couple would undertake to have just one baby and no more. In this way, the population would be reduced by many millions within a single generation. In the beginning, the policy appeared to be working. In every Chinese city, in the streets and supermarkets, dutiful parents could be seen with a single child to care for. But it wasn't long before it became obvious that there were serious problems. If they were to have just one child, most couples wanted a boy. This led to innumerable abortions being performed every year. In the countryside, where medical help was harder to come by, the practice of infanticide grew alarmingly. The authorities in Beijing realized that they were creating a serious imbalance between the sexes. People accused them of turning China into a nation of little emperors with no initiative and nothing to strive for. These were not criticisms of the idea itself, which was bold and imaginative, and addressed the very real problem of overpopulation, but rather were expressions of a natural human reaction to being pushed around and to having intimate family life controlled from the top. There is a new leadership in China now. It seems likely that the one-child policy will either be abolished or changed out of all recognition. China is changing very rapidly. 30 years ago, these girls would have been among the poorest of the poor, scratching a living from the rocky, arid soil, each year falling further and further behind their urban compatriots. Without the one-child policy, these girls would today have been competing for jobs with an additional 300 million Chinese at a conservative estimate. Put another way, had the demographic growth of the early 1980s continued, China today would have had a population of over 1.6 billion. Ironically, it was the building of the Great Wall itself that robbed China of large areas of fertile land, as forestry professor Guan Jing explains.
It seems that everybody knows China have Great Wall, but we paid it. We should suffer many difficulties for build this Great Wall. Should cut the woods to make blocks, So many trees cut down during ancient time, so the green disappears.
For years, no one knew the precise length of the Great Wall, but the official figure, when all the different sections are added together, is now put at 2,000 kilometers. Its military purpose was to protect China's frontier from Huns and Mongols invading from the north. One dynasty followed another, but all had the overriding goal of protecting China's cultural identity from the influence of foreign barbarians. Little did they realize it, through the many centuries of the wall's construction, but the real threat to the Chinese way of life would not come from marauding horsemen to the north, but from ships approaching China's eastern seaboard with unwelcome new ideas from America and Europe. But from the magnificent vantage point of the old wall, something quite new can now be seen. The barren landscape is becoming greener year by year. A huge tree planting program has been in progress since the 1980s, a great wall of green, so to speak, the biggest in the world, bigger probably than all the other tree planting programs combined. This place is called Wanning. Not many people visit it or even know of its existence. Wanning is situated on the island of Hainan, the most southerly part of China, off the coast of Vietnam, about as far as you can get from the Great Wall and still be on Chinese soil. The place is known for one reason above all. The only forest of Vatica trees in all of China is situated here. As a consequence, it has become a national reserve. The wood of the Vatica tree is very hard. It attracts very few insects or diseases, and the trees live to a great age. There are a pair of them in Vietnam, just across the Gulf of Tonkin, that are said to be 2,000 years old. The local people regard them as sacred, protecting them from evil spirits. The Chinese take a more practical view. 1 century ago, the Emperor Gongzhu saved the Vatica tree from extinction. His name is still honoured at the forestry station in Wanning. If China meets its target by the year 2050, man-made forests will cover 42% of the entire Chinese landmass. 500,000 square kilometres have already been planted, twice the area of Great Britain. Nothing like it has ever been attempted before, but the results have not so far been exclusively positive, as Lester Brown explains.
They are making some progress, but the last data that I have seen for China indicates that though they plant quite a few trees, their survival rates are not very high. And one of the interesting things about the desertification in the north and the western parts of China, which is extreme. I mean, there's a huge dust bowl that's formed in northwestern China, western Mongolia, Central Asia. And every spring, after the snow melts, beginning in maybe February or March, for the next 2 or 3 months, there are huge dust storms coming out of that region. They not only affect the cities in eastern China, or the people in eastern China, but also in South Korea, in Japan, and occasionally some of these dust storms, under the right atmospheric conditions, will cross the Pacific Ocean, and you see dust in the western United States.
Chinese foresters are well aware how important it is to select the right species to match the environment.
Not just plant the trees. You should, according to the advanced scientific theory, you should plant those trees very naturally. Those trees get together, not just 1 tree, 2 tree, plus, so forth. You should close to regional forest.
There have been times in the past when Chinese foresters have planted trees when grass might have been a better solution to prevent the desert from spreading. But on mountain summits, the opposite is true. Up here, nothing will survive the icy winds unless it's protected by man-made stone shelters for each individual tree. The villagers of Pingshun have been doing this arduous, back-breaking work for generations, and 28 million trees have been replanted in this way. It's part of the policy of the leaders in Beijing to find heroes and heroines from among the local people, however humble their origins. In the village of Sanxi, Mrs. Wei Guying has achieved that honor. She persuaded the villagers in her district to plant over 2 million trees, completely transforming the landscape not far from the Great Wall. For a woman with little education, living the life of a humble peasant, this was a remarkable achievement. The village where she lives is as unpretentious as she is. Mrs. Wei fits perfectly into the role that the party's leaders have carved out for her. Unselfish, modest, hard-working, she is an ideal heroine of the people. Some of the pictures may be old and fading, but the memory of those days is as bright as ever. At that time, she was at the height of her success, a living example of the Chinese way of doing things. Communism with a human face, you might say. With, others might add, Confucius smiling from his place in heaven.
我现在就一个人俺们家那伙孩子他在外头供养学生，忙了回来跟我干活，剩下都是我一个人，一个人领着人家干活，本村人过上。是不容易，不容易。
14 years have passed since she was first photographed, receiving awards for her achievements from some of the highest in the land. Back in 1999, nobody could be certain that her trees would flourish or even survive. But now, 14 years later, when she takes the same path, the lush green landscape tells that the semi-desert has been replaced by a veritable Garden of Eden. The story's been repeated in thousands of places all over China. The government has made sure that there are people like Mrs. Wei to be found everywhere. In the last decade, China's citizens have planted over 55 billion trees. This is 2.5 times more trees than have been planted in the whole of the rest of the world. When Mrs. Wei and her villagers started this tree planting, they were informed that in many places the tree planting had been a failure. Nobody had told them what kind of trees they had to plant, but simply believing in the slogan that China will be greening the mountains, they took part anyway. But to give the local people an extra source of income, Mrs. Wei made an early decision to plant a high proportion of fruit trees for the benefit of herself, the village, and for the whole region. Mrs. Wei's dream of improving her family's living standard has come true. Now she lives in a palace compared to the house she used to live in. Today, even in the most rural areas of modern China, new roads and bridges are evidence of a rising standard of living. But the countryside is still very backward compared to the rapidly developing urban areas. You hear the same questions asked here as you do in Western democracies. Should the decision-making process start at the top or at the bottom? Who knows what's best for the future, central government or the people themselves?
If we're talking about that, is they back the history, because the China, before we have the reform and we have the planning, mechanism, and that is have the top down and process, and the local people in the very lower bottom, and they want to receive, the introduction or that the order, something like that. They do everything that is obeyed by the government. But now we changed so much. We have the, we call the market process, and that is really start from the bottom to up process. And now we're doing that.
Apart from South Korea, no country at any time in the world's history has changed so rapidly from being a rural agricultural community into an urban one as China. One of the big questions for China now is how to maintain the pace of change without leaving the vast rural hinterland so far behind that it begins to feel like another country. These women seem happy enough, making their own entertainment out in the fields. The song is a traditional one, as timeless as the seasons. But how will their children react when every day, on their computers and television screens, they catch glimpses of that other China, of 200 new cities, each with 1 million people? But in spite of the pace of change in modern China, old age traditions still have their place and can be deeply revered. These people may be tourists, but they are tourists with a purpose. Each year they come in their thousands to Sanya, China's most southern city. In April 2005, when Chairman Mao's Little Red Book was all but forgotten, a new statue to the Buddhist deity Guanyin was formally unveiled. 108 meters high, it's one of the tallest in the world. In some respects, the legend of Guanyin is just as relevant today as it was when it was first introduced to China in the 1st century AD. Guanyin offers clean water to mankind, the divine nectar of life, and is associated with compassion and wisdom. No one could have predicted that one day water would be in such desperately short supply. China is still a world leader in discharging carbon emissions, but it is aware of this problem and is working hard and fast to replace fossil energy, particularly where new cities are under construction. Each new town and city is under strict environmental control, and construction must comply with regulations laid down by the World Resource Institute. There can be no doubt China takes the imminent threat of global warming very seriously, and in the case of new city planning, they are in the forefront. The World Resources Institute hopes that lessons learned here will be an example to other rapidly developing nations like India, Brazil, and Indonesia. All of our sources of energy on this planet are, in one form or another, byproducts of the sun. The task now is to devise harmless ways of harnessing them.
Today, the energy from the sun in nature is captured and is only possible to be captured by a plant. How does it do this? A photon of light comes and hits the leaf of the plant, goes inside, and it hits the molecule that is doing the photosynthesis, and that photon of light just pushes one electron in the electron shell to jump up, and that electron then eventually in a nanosecond falls back, and that energy goes out. That is the energy that drives all of life. But remember, that goes up and comes down in a nanosecond. What life has learned is how to capture that electron, that energy, and slowly decant it, making it possible for you and me to live, making it possible for all this to happen. Right? That is how solar energy is used by plants.
What an achievement it would be if, one day, humankind were to manage to imitate green nature's brilliant way of catching energy from the sun. We're at the very beginning of a new age of clean, renewable energy. Where will it take us? Who can say? Human beings have an almost infinite capacity for misunderstanding the world around them. For centuries, mangrove forests have been regarded as muddy, smelly places full of snakes and mosquitoes, and always to be found where the land meets the sea. In other words, in precisely those places where human beings had plans for harbours and cities to meet the needs of our burgeoning population. In fact, in some parts of the world, mangroves are vital for coastal protection. Their massive root systems rob the waves of their power, protecting the coastline from erosion and the severe damage that can be caused by hurricanes and tsunamis. Mangroves are ideal breeding grounds for fish and a paradise for crustaceans like oysters, crabs, lobsters and mussels. In other words, a valuable source of food. Man must learn to work with nature and not against it. About half the world's mangrove forests have already been destroyed. Fortunately, much of the mangrove forests that remain in China are now under government protection. Along the east coast of Hainan Island, you come to the little town of Changhuazhen. Here, as in so much of China, solar energy is beginning to take over from fossil fuels. In the subtropical climate of these southern regions, people can live a large part of their lives in the open air. But we're going inside a house to meet someone special. Her name is Tao Fengjiao. A few years into her marriage, her husband died. But far from being downhearted, she looked around for some way of benefiting her community in memory of him. She noticed how quickly sand was taking over the whole coastline after the mangrove forest was cut down. One day, perhaps the trees would return, but in the meantime, something would have to be done to stop the relentless advance of the sand. Walking along the beach for many hours each day, she decided to put her faith in the tough local grass, which seemed to require very little water. Forest experts told her she had no chance of preventing the steady advance of the stand. But Tao Fengjiao persevered. It was desperately slow, back-breaking work. To begin with, there was no one to help her because no one else shared her dream. They thought she was mad even to attempt such a task. But very gradually things began to change. The monotonous brown of the sand gave way to patches of green, which grew larger and more established as one season followed another. One woman, by the strength of her own will, had halted the advance of the desert. Tao Fengjiao became famous, but never for a moment did it change her lifestyle. China has seen more radical changes over the last 50 years than almost any other country on our planet. No one can predict what the future will hold, either for the People's Republic or for any other part of the world. Triumph or disaster can fall from the sky at any moment. At the beginning of the Second World War, the United States was adhering to its policy of isolationism. of not getting involved in another European imbroglio. That attitude changed overnight with the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was militarily very successful. I mean, they knew the U.S. Pacific Fleet, a large part, were at anchor. Many of our major destroyers and cruisers and so forth in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and they managed to sink most of them in that fast. Suddenly, it was clear that we were in the war, whether we wanted to be or not. What it demonstrated was how quickly things can change, because the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. If you had conducted a poll on Saturday, December 6th, 1941, and asked the American people, do you think we should get involved in the war? Probably 95% would have said no. If you waited till Monday, December 8th, after the attack, and said, do you think we should get involved in the war? Probably 95% would have said yes. I mention that because it shows how quickly things can change. I mean, it took a catastrophic event in military terms. My guess is that the wake-up call for us, whether we're thinking about population growth or forests or water or what have you, is going to come on the food front. And the first economic indicator will be rising grain prices. The first social indicator will be a huge increase in the number of hungry people. And the third indicator will be an increase in the number of failing states and political instability in the world.
In South Africa, events did not move quite so fast, but they were just as momentous. 69 Africans were killed in the Sharpeville massacre of March 1960, which was the start of organized resistance to apartheid and to white supremacy. It would be another 30 years before Nelson Mandela was finally released from imprisonment on Robben Island, an event which would have a profound effect throughout the continent of Africa, indeed the whole world. He emerged from his long ordeal without bitterness or any desire for revenge, but determined to make life better for his people. Far too many South African families were still living in shanty towns, sometimes with no electricity, running water or proper drainage. Killer diseases like AIDS and tuberculosis were part of everyone's experience, with too few hospitals and schools for the rapidly expanding population. Knowing it would take many years, Mandela was determined to find solutions to all the country's problems, while at the same time giving everyone the right to personal freedom. In one of his first speeches after 27 years in jail, Mandela urged the whole country to become a rainbow nation, where people of all races and every colour would live in harmony together.
In our own country, we have taken steps to ensure that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that it enshrines do not just remain a piece of paper. We have what we call the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which you know very well and which you have been supporting, and the Constitutional Court. Any citizen whose rights are threatened or violated can go to any of these bodies, which are completely independent, which can only be dissolved by an act of parliament. And we would like that situation in every country.
Mandela fervently hoped that his words would be heeded by the many different African tribes, as well as by the English, Afrikaans and Indian settlers. The Zulus particularly have a proud but warlike reputation, sometimes causing alarm and distress to their more peaceful neighbours. Namibia achieved its independence in 1990, the year of Nelson Mandela's release. This vast country, the size of France and Germany together, only has a population of just over 2 million people. When the country was originally colonized by Germany in the 1880s, there was a vicious massacre of the local tribespeople, which has never been forgotten.
We cannot go back to the years before the Europeans arrived here. Therefore, our colonial heritage is much part of our identity at the present moment. Yes, it has costed us thousands and millions of lives. Yes, there was agony and suffering of the people. But out of that suffering, a very new identity, a new experience is coming out. And certainly I would like to tell you that we are now part of the modern world.
For Namibia, not everything has proceeded according to plan. With a very long Atlantic coastline, there were high hopes for a prosperous fishing industry. But instead of the 2 million tons of fish they were hoping to catch each year, the best they could manage was 1 million. Overfishing has occurred, and currents in that part of the Atlantic have changed. The result, a deterioration in the fish breeding grounds. This was bad news for the country's fragile economy. Namibia is relatively free from the problems that seem to beset its neighbours, problems of deep-seated corruption, rigged elections, and the misuse of political power. For a country with such a tiny population, it should be possible to create a new vision for its future. Some of the traditional ways of making a profit out of tourists here have become discredited in recent years, and in some parts of Africa declared illegal. Half a century ago, ashtrays and ornaments carved out of ivory could be seen in the houses of the well-to-do all over Europe and America. Ivory was the obvious gift to take home at the end of a safari holiday. There's just one snag. In order to obtain it, you have to kill its original natural-born owner. The problem is that poor people, who are paid by very distant and often very dishonest business people, and who are desperate to give a better life to their families, are willing to risk their own freedom by becoming poachers. Serious poaching has been going on a long time in Africa and still goes on. Conservationists in the Western world and elsewhere have protested and put pressure on African leaders to regulate wildlife hunting more effectively. In Zambia, President Kenneth Kaunda was one of them to show a strong conservation ethic. In his attempts in the 1970s to restrict poaching, he was helped by the World Wildlife Fund and Scandinavian aid organizations.
We have a duty, a responsibility as human beings to look after wildlife, because we really, in the end, are part and parcel of that wildlife. Without it, our own life is not what it should be. That's why I take such a keen interest in wildlife.
There have been success stories. In Zambia, poaching was in fact substantially reduced. But the really important change occurred in Namibia, when the country gained its freedom in 1990. Namibia was the first nation in the world to bring climate and nature into its constitution. When Namibia joined the family of nations as an independent country, it was teeming with game, and its leaders decided to go in the right direction from the start. Namibia was poor, but had one important resource, its nature, and decided to involve its whole population in its new course. Visitors coming for camera safaris or seeking success as trophy hunters got the same warm welcome. In many African countries, hunting is still not being managed in a sustainable way as it is in Namibia. Namibia allows 12,000 animals to be hunted by foreign visitors every year, and these visitors are guided by professional Namibians.
Very good. Thank you. Good.
The human instinct for hunting goes very deep. Having meat on the table has always, stretching back into prehistoric times, meant hunting.
Very good shot as well.
Here in Namibia, the hunter returns home after spending a lot of money. Money coming directly from wildlife and tourism, which is incorporated in Namibia's GNP. Even if he has a trophy from Namibia on his conscience, the hunter knows that he has in the long run helped to increase the wildlife stock in Namibia. Namibia's way of putting the new priorities highlighted in its constitution into practice can be a lesson for the rest of Africa and for the world beyond Africa. Over millions of years, our planet has given us a huge variety of environments, which in turn have shaped the character of the people who share them. This is Norway, birthplace of the great scientist and explorer Thor Heyerdahl, a man with a wandering spirit that would take him all over the globe. Thor Heyerdahl died in 2002. His son, who has the same name, still lives with his family in Norway. He has traced the route of his father's many famous expeditions, studying his work in great detail. In 1955, as a young boy, he went with his father to Easter Island as the youngest member of the Aku Aku expedition, the first serious attempt to unravel some of the mysteries about the island's history.
My very first impression was that it was so barren. There were no trees. I expected a South Sea island to be covered with rich and lush vegetation. That was my very first impression.
Then, as now, there were hardly any roads on Easter Island. Horses were the main means of transport, if you were lucky enough to get hold of one. The boy on the bicycle is Thor Heyerdahl Jr., filmed more than half a century ago. Thor Heyerdahl's expedition in 1955 was the first attempt to put together a complete picture of the island's history. During those frantic years when the Moai were first carved, the lush vegetation that once covered the whole island disappeared, leaving the barren landscape that we see today. Some strange compulsion drove the island's people to carve more and more of the giant statues at the expense of more normal activities like growing food and caring for the environment. Archaeologists are still not certain whether the Moai represented gods or men. Meanwhile, other aspects of life were willfully neglected. How could the people have remained unaware that the forests they relied on for building houses and fishing canoes were rapidly disappearing? Even the island's favourite tree, a species of toromiro unique to Easter Island, very nearly became extinct. One local person who has made herself an expert on toromiro is Sonia Haua.
So the toromiro, I will think, is just like a national plant for the island. Identify the island. There is a many places have toromiro or sophora. It's not like toromiro, but it's the same family. You have in the south of Chile, you have in New Zealand, you have in different places. But this toromiro is quite different. And it's made different because it's grown in different area, it's grown in different soil, it's more volcanic, and so and so. So that's the make the plant endemic.
Today, thousands of toromiro plants, coming from botanical gardens in various parts of the world, are back on the island where their long and checkered history began. They will soon be back in the soil that nurtured their forebears.
Why somebody from the other side of the world have to come and take the seed to 50 years after to have this plant?
It was Thor Heyerdahl, on his expedition in 1955, who realized that the toromiro had not been completely eliminated from Easter Island.
I was together with my father then, down in one of the craters, the Ranokau crater. We came across a butt, and there was a sprout growing out from that butt, and that was a toromiro sprout. And my father collected seeds from that sprout and took the Swedes with him back to Norway.
The seeds were taken to Gothenburg Botanical Garden in Sweden for further development, and it took many years of painstaking work before a new generation of Toromiro trees could be developed. Even then the job was far from over. In many parts of Easter Island it was discovered that the soil structure had completely changed. Grassland, rather than forest, has been the main feature, leaving the landscape very vulnerable to wind erosion. Unless urgent measures are taken, nothing of any substance will grow on the island at all. At present, a special variety of pine trees is being introduced. This is proving quite successful. The young trees are adapting to the climate of the South Pacific remarkably well. But much more biodiversity is needed, which a natural forest would provide. At the beginning of the 20th century, a handful of Scottish migrants tried to set up a boat-building enterprise on the island. As a fast-growing source of timber, they introduced the eucalyptus tree. They have never been popular with the islanders, but for Sonja Hauer, a few eucalyptuses are better than no trees at all.
For many people it's not good. But can you imagine the island with no eucalyptus? Everything is gone. So in one hand, the eucalyptus is not so bad for the island. Yeah? It might be not the great things for the soil, but at least we have something. And that is very important because it's easy to criticize, but when you see in a vegetation way, well, it's what we have.
The decision has been taken. In a few years' time, Easter Island will once again have natural forests of great diversity, with the unique Toromiro, so very nearly faced with extinction, taking pride of place in all of them. Easter Island has been called a mini-planet, a tiny speck in the middle of our green planet, which is, of course, only a tiny speck in the vastness of the universe. In the story of Easter Island, we can find echoes and reflections of our own triumphs and disasters as we stumble towards an unknown future, hoping against hope that we will not destroy the very things we are seeking to preserve.
One of my basic concerns is that the number of failing states in the world will keep increasing. And we know that for the last several years, each year there are more failing states than the year before. And that raises a disturbing question, which is how many failing states before our global civilization begins to unravel? We don't know. We haven't been here before.
Easter Island has been declared a World Heritage Site. It's been handed down to us to preserve, according to our best practices and finest traditions. The green planet carries an infinitely greater burden of responsibility. To fail in our duty to future generations would be unthinkable.